Let's go ahead and get started, since I think we should by now have pretty much everybody here. So first of all, let me say welcome to T516 International Taxation 2, focused on United States international taxation aspects of outbound taxation. You'll see that there's a number of required and recommended readings. The required readings, please do it. Because, as we'll talk a little bit more later, this whole area of international taxation is very much one where there's a forest that you need to understand, but by the very nature of what we're doing, this is part of the law. We also have to be able to know what the trees are. So there's two parts, the overall and the tree by tree, so to speak, the overall forest of the trees. So the trees you really do have to look at and see what's there. As I'll reiterate probably a few times, I don't want you to memorize things. I don't want you to try to memorize things. Because the books are already there. You can open them anytime you want. As you'll eventually get to, the final exam will be open book, open anything. Because the real world is, you have to know where to find things, and what their significance is. You don't have to memorize them. In terms of recommended readings, I've taken some time to indicate sections of a few different books. These are two of them. International Taxation in a Nutshell, and this International Taxation, Joseph Eisenberg. Both of these will be down in the reserve section downstairs. So I find them to be good discussions. This one, the guy has a reasonable sense of humor. And also he writes about the things that interest him. You'll find that things that don't interest him, he really doesn't cover very much. So, but in any case, they can be very useful. I've also mentioned, I think, somewhere in the material that I've given you, that if you're really serious about international, that you might want to consider investing in the Bitker and Loken book, which is sort of your Bitker and Eustace, but specifically international as opposed to just corporate. It has a lot of ad nauseum detail, but it's discussion which is readable. It's got very, very good footnotes on where things are coming from, and so that if you're interested in something, you can get back to the source. And then the last thing I'll mention, again, in terms of supplemental reading, the BNA portfolios, Bureau of National Affairs portfolios. There's a separate section on international portfolios, which includes a number of different things, things affecting outbound, things affecting inbound, description of taxation in other countries. Sadly, there's not one on Thailand. For those in the room who are from Thailand, maybe that's an opportunity for you in the future. But in any case, this is a good resource for trying to make sense of some of the things you're studying when you're looking at the trees and you're saying, why is that there? So I've tried to indicate in the material, which of course is in here and which is also in soft copy on the course website, things that you can look to. Another resource in the sense of recommended readings, you'll find that a lot of law firms and the 4 major accounting firms have a tremendous amount of information on international taxation, conditions in other countries, ideas, what have you. And these things are all available to you. Real world is you've got access to everything. Real world is that if something's new to you, you can learn what it's about. The best example I can think of, in terms of this kind of thing, I remember when I was working in New York some years ago, and a client called and said, "What do you know about tire leasing?" Now, I'd never heard of the concept before. Now, was my answer absolutely nothing and put the phone down? No, my answer was, well, what do you want to know? Well, that turned into a week's project of learning about the fact that there was an industry of tire leasing, on buses that go on a known route or trucks that go on a relatively known route. Tire leasing was, at that time, very normal. And, well, why did companies do this? Well, I learned that companies did this because the company that owned the bus or the truck, they didn't want to have the unknown cost of how many times tires would fail. So they want a known amount, and they want to pass the risk of whether the tire will fail or not onto the company which is leasing the tire and in theory is taking that risk. So fine. It's easy. I learn about this. I talk to people in the industry. I get copies of tire leasing contracts and ended up helping the client. So that's the real world. Well, it's the same thing with the final. It's the real world. You have access to those things. And throughout the course, hopefully you'll get an idea of, well, where do I find things? When we studied this particular aspect of subpart F, I looked at these items and I think, that's somewhat where I found it. And your final is hopefully going to be easier because you have a sense of where things are. So a lot of this course is not only the big picture of why is subpart F there, and how do you use it either defensively against the government, or if you're the government, offensively against the taxpayer or whatever. It's also, how do I answer a question involving subpart F? Where's the information? You've, of course, as you well know, you've got primary sources and secondary sources. All these additional recommended reading items that I mentioned are secondary sources. You can't tell a client, in a sense, well, this is so because I read it in a BNA. Especially if you're dealing with in-house counsel at a client's office, probably they're not going to appreciate your telling them that. Now, interestingly, at least for me, over the course of my career, I would say probably 90% of the conclusions which I can, at various times have given on things, they come out of the code. Maybe 5% out of the regulations and 5% out of court cases and rulings and other things. The code in this country is so detailed that a tremendous number of your answers come from it. And if you know how to use it, very often you'll get to what you need faster, much faster than trying to go to secondary sources first. Now, again, in this classroom situation, yeah, secondary sources are going to help you understand why something's there. It will hopefully help give you the bigger picture. But the reality is, as lawyers, you have to know what the real primary source is. Now, and it's important to go to the primary source, because the secondary source you're looking at, the person who wrote it may have had some different situation in mind. Might not apply to your client's situation. So you pretty much always have to go back to the primary source anyway. So the top item on the list of tools, yes, is the code. And secondarily, the regs, and then, of course, secondary sources. Now, you'll notice I've left out, obviously, primary sources in the sense of rulings and court cases. That's not to say that they're not there. It's just that, in a sense, for purposes of our discussion in class, normally the code and the regs is going to be enough. Now, as you do research in connection with the group project, you might want to do a little more research and see what you find. But again, most of what we're concerned about is going to come out of the code and regs. At this point in my life, carry an AARP card. Anybody know what AARP stands for? Yeah, American Association of Retired Persons. So as a result, I'm, give or take a bit, available 24 hours a day. And remember that being, whether it's on the public accounting side or the legal side, is a service business. So the mentality is a 24-hour-a-day thing, because, gee, if you don't service your client, he's going to go to somebody else. So if you think of it that way, you're my clients, despite the fact that I think of this as charitable work. My wife especially thinks that it's charitable work. But having said that, the point is, if you have a question about something, please feel free to email. That's whether it's in connection with anything we discuss in class, we don't discuss in class, in regard to a group project, that's fine. So anything, please. I'm very happy to have a dialogue. And if I think the response will benefit the group, I will copy the group on the response. So you have a little bit of an idea on my background. Why am I up here? Aside from the fact that I'm retired and have time to torture people with things like this. I started in this, what I like to call monkey business, in 1969 when I got out of university with an undergraduate degree in accounting and a master's of business administration. I do not have a law degree. I was accepted to a law school, but something that those of you, especially the male element, probably no longer worry about is the draft. I had the draft ahead of me. Do you know what I'm referring to when I say the draft? You still know that. That's good to hear. See, they could bring it back, and today, if they brought it back, they'd probably bring it back on a co-ed basis. You haven't thought about that, did you? Okay. Well, anyway, so I knew I had the Army ahead of me, and this was during the height of the Vietnam War. So since they needed people, law school was at that time not a valid deferment opportunity. So because of that, I, in a sense, got into, but never got into law school itself. I started working, then got drafted, spent 2 years in the Army. Fortunately, spent the whole 2 years at Fort Ord, California, which is now closed. But it's right next to Carmel, Monterey. So I was not hurting in any real sense from having been in the Army. Anyway, after that, I went back to New York, where I'd started in '69. I went back to New York in '71, worked there through 1977, then went overseas the first time, which was to Hong Kong for a couple of years, then to Singapore for 3 years. Then I had to look at a map to see where Houston was, because I found out I was transferred to Houston. Was there for 4.5 years. Then I'd been climbing the walls for a couple of years, wanting to get out of Houston, and the opportunity to go to Japan came up, so that was then 6 years in Japan, 5 years in Russia, then back to Japan for 3 years, then to Turkey for a little over a year, and then I retired. And I've been happily retired bicycle riding since then. Now, I'm teaching a U.S. tax course. The last time I worked in the U.S. tax area was 1986. So you should consider me very dangerous. I should not be trusted to give advice on U.S. matters. Does this stop me from teaching it? Well, fortunately, no, because you're not likely to sue me for malpractice. But having said that, I was very comfortable to come back into this because despite all the rhetoric of how much the '86 Reform Act changed things and so on, what we're looking at today is pretty much the same as what I was working with back in the mid-1980s or in the 1970s. So, in any case, while I wouldn't necessarily trust the advice I would give to a real live person, and I tell a real live client, and I would tell them to make sure they check with somebody who was really currently competent on the matter, I'm still very comfortable to talk about these things. And I also, fortunately, have a little bit of background in terms of the kinds of business transactions that companies get into or that individuals get into. And these things are what bring our subject alive.